Hey guys, tonight we delve into something deeply fascinating yet undeniably disturbing. The truth about how people were punished in the past. We're about to journey through time, exploring some of the most shocking, inventive, and cruel methods of punishment that humans have ever devised. From ancient empires to medieval dungeons and beyond, we'll uncover the dark secrets of historical justice, or what passed for justice in those days. Before we jump in, make sure you're comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, grab a blanket, or turn on a fan for a gentle background hum. If you find yourself drawn into this dark journey through history, consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from different corners of the world. Now, take a deep breath. Let all the stress of the day melt away. We're about to step into a different world, a world lit by flickering torches and shadowed by tall gallows, where the concept of punishment was often as brutal as it was bizarre. I'll guide you through each twist and turn so you can relax even as we explore some truly unsettling practices. Ready? Let's begin our journey into the disturbing truth about historical punishment methods. Chapter 1. An eye for an eye, early justice and brutality. Our story begins in the distant past, thousands of years ago, in the cradle of civilization. Picture ancient Mesopotamia, around 1750 BC, where King Hammurabi of Babylon inscribed one of the first law codes in history. This code set the tone for justice for centuries to come with a simple but severe principle. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. In other words, whatever harm you caused, the same would be inflicted upon you as punishment. If you blinded someone, you too would be blinded. If you broke someone's bone, your bone would be broken in return. The idea was harsh, but to the people of that time, it felt like justice, a straightforward balancing of scales in a world that could be cruel and unforgiving. In those days, punishments weren't about rehabilitation or gentle correction. They were about retribution and deterrence. For example, under Hammurabi's code, if a son struck his father, the son's hands could be cut off. If a builder's poorly made house collapsed and killed the owner, that builder might be put to death for his negligence. Laws were etched in stone, literally, for all to see, a public reminder that wrongdoing had dire consequences. Now imagine living in such a world. In the dusty streets of Babylon or Nineveh, you would constantly be aware that any crime or misstep could invoke the wrath of these severe laws. The disturbing truth here is that these early legal systems often cared more about vengeance than mercy. They were born out of a need to keep order when central authority was weak and life was precarious. Fear was a tool of control. If people were terrified of the punishments, perhaps they would think twice before breaking the law. Travel a bit further in time and space, and you find similar harsh justice in the laws of the ancient Hebrews and other cultures. In biblical times, certain offenses, like adultery or blasphemy, could be met with death by stoning. A crowd of people, sometimes including your own neighbors, would hurl stones at you until your body could take no more. It was brutal and communal, a way for society itself to viscerally reject someone who violated its rules. Meanwhile, in ancient Egypt, while not much is as famously recorded about their legal punishments as their elaborate burial rituals, there were certainly severe penalties for crimes. Tomb robbers, for instance, could face execution or mutilation. The Egyptians valued the afterlife so deeply that disturbing a tomb was among the worst offenses, deserving of the harshest retribution. As civilization advanced, so too did the creativity, or cruelty, of its punishments. The ancient world, from the Middle East to the Mediterranean, was rife with methods to make offenders suffer and to instill fear in anyone watching. To us today, these methods might seem wildly disproportionate or gruesome, but to our ancestors, they were a grim necessity. The only way they knew to enforce order when other tools like prisons were either non-existent or insufficient. One stark example from the ancient Near East comes from the Assyrian Empire, a civilization known not just for its grand palaces and libraries, but also for its ferocity in war and punishment. Assyrian kings were notorious for their cruelty towards those who rebelled or opposed them. We have records carved into stone pillars where Assyrian rulers bragged about what they did to their enemies. They didn't just defeat rebels, they made examples of them. They might cut off the noses, ears, or limbs of prisoners to mark them forever, or execute them in ways meant to horrify onlookers. In fact, the Assyrians practiced one of the most skin-crawling punishments imaginable: flaying, which means removing a person's skin. Try to imagine the terror of that. Being captured, knowing that your fate was not a quick death, but a slow peeling away of your very skin. Assyrian records coldly describe such acts. In one account, a victorious king describes flaying rebel leaders and draping their skins over the city walls as a warning. It's hard to wrap our modern minds around the spectacle, the sun beating down on these grisly banners of human skin, a whole city forced to see and remember the cost of defiance. The disturbing truth is that in some ancient societies, brutality was a form of communication. It sent a message. This is what happens if you cross us. Of course, punishments weren't always so exotic as flaying or as neatly reciprocal as an eye for an eye. Sometimes the simplest method was deemed best. And what could be simpler than death itself? Execution has been a cornerstone of justice across cultures, but even execution comes in many forms, as we'll see in the chapters ahead. Early on, one common method was just the use of a sword or axe to behead the condemned. Swift, if the executioner was skilled, and final. But a clean beheading might have been too merciful for some societies' tastes when it came to the worst criminals. They wanted something that caused more suffering, or at least more shock. So let's take another example from the ancient world. Imagine being thrown off a cliff. It sounds strangely straightforward, but picture the scene. A high precipice, the condemned forced to the edge, perhaps after being beaten or paraded around, and then cast down into the void. The ancient Greeks and Romans both used this method for certain crimes. In Rome, there was a steep cliff called the Tarpeian Rock, from which traitors were hurled to their deaths. No elaborate torture devices, no fire or steel, just gravity doing the work. Yet, in its simplicity, it was terrifying, a very public and very final spectacle. From these early days of human law, a pattern was emerging. The more severe the crime, or the more threatening the authority felt the crime was, the more severe and dramatic the punishment. Stealing a sheep might get you a beating or a hand chopped off, but treason, betraying your city or your king, that called for something special, something memorable in its horror. The world of ancient justice was not a gentle place. It was believed that without harsh penalties, chaos would reign. Mercy was seen by many rulers as weakness, and in a time when kings and emperors ruled by fear as much as by love, showing any weakness could invite rebellion. Thus, the laws and their punishments became ever harsher, as if cruelty itself could prop up the pillars of society. So as we leave this chapter of early justice, take a moment to reflect on how far we've come and how far we still have to go. The idea of justice in those times was deeply entangled with cruelty. People accepted these methods as normal, even divinely sanctioned in some cases. Perhaps some slept soundly at night, believing that such punishments kept them safe. It's a chilling thought that ordinary families in ancient Babylon or Jerusalem might have felt a grim comfort in knowing a thief had his hand cut off, thinking, well, that will teach others not to steal. In the next chapter, we'll venture into the realms of mighty empires and see how power and punishment often went hand in hand. From the cruelty of the Assyrians to the peculiar punishments of the Persians, prepare yourself. The methods of execution and torture only get more brutal as we proceed. Chapter 2: Masters of Cruelty. Punishments of Ancient Empires. As civilization spread and great empires rose, punishments became even more inventive, and in many cases, more ghastly. Power often expressed itself through cruelty, as mighty rulers sought to instill fear and obedience. In this chapter, we travel to the time of the Assyrians and Persians, imperial giants of the ancient world, to witness how they dealt with those who broke their laws or threatened their thrones. The Assyrian Empire, which we touched on earlier, truly perfected the art of making examples out of people. We already saw their fondness for flaying and mutilation as tools of terror. But they had other methods too. One particularly gruesome Assyrian practice was impalement. Picture a tall wooden stake planted into the ground, its tip sharpened to a point. Now picture the condemned, often a defeated enemy soldier or a rebel leader, lifted up and forced down onto that stake so that it penetrated through the body. The victim's own weight would slowly drag them down further onto the pole. Death did not come swiftly. Hours, maybe days of agony might pass before the merciful end. Assyrian carvings actually depict rows of impaled captives outside city walls, a forest of human bodies on stakes, left to die slowly as a warning to anyone watching. It's a horrifying image, yet this was a real tactic of psychological warfare in the ancient Near East. Now let's journey a little further east in both time and space, to the Persian Empire, a land of fabulous wealth, grand palaces, and, it turns out, some of the most chilling punishments ever recorded. The Persians, especially during the Achaemenid dynasty, think of kings like Darius and Xerxes, inherited some of the brutal practices of earlier Mesopotamian cultures and added their own twists. One infamous Persian execution method was known as scaphism, or the boats. The very description of scaphism can make one's skin crawl. The story goes that a Persian prince named Artaxerxes II once ordered this punishment for a soldier named Mithridates who had offended him. Here's how it worked. The condemned person would be stripped naked and securely fastened inside a pair of narrow wooden boats or hollowed-out tree trunks, one on the bottom, one on top, so that only their head, hands, and feet stuck out. They were essentially trapped, lying down, in a coffin-like enclosure. Then, the executioners force-fed the victim a mixture of milk and honey, and also smeared this sweet concoction all over the exposed head and limbs of the person. At first glance, being fed milk and honey doesn't sound like punishment, but there was a sick genius to it. The diet of milk and honey soon caused the victim to develop severe diarrhea inside that enclosed space. The unfortunate person was essentially stewing in their own waste, unable to escape or even move much. Now comes the horrific part. All that excrement, combined with the honey smeared on the body, began to attract insects, flies, beetles, and who knows what other crawling horrors swarmed toward the bound victim. They would lay eggs in the filth. Maggots would hatch. Biting insects would burrow into flesh. The person, still alive through all of this, might be repeatedly fed more milk and honey to prolong the torture. Days would pass, infection set in, flesh was being literally eaten away by bugs. According to ancient accounts, a person undergoing scaphism could linger for more than a week in this unimaginable state, alive and conscious as insects devoured them slowly. Eventually, infection or sheer exhaustion would bring death, but not before the condemned had endured one of the most agonizing exits from this world ever conceived. It's such a grotesque method that historians have long debated whether the Persians truly did this, or if the Greeks and others exaggerated it to paint their enemies as barbarians. But whether it was common or not, the fact that someone even imagined this process, let alone potentially carried it out, speaks volumes about the darker corners of the human mind. The disturbing truth is that where there is a will to enforce power through fear, people can come up with the most nightmarish torments. The Persians had other feared punishments as well. Another method, far quicker than scaphism but equally startling, involved a large vat of ash. In certain cases, a condemned man might be placed into a deep, empty cistern or tower, which was then filled with hot ash and powdered charcoal. Picture the scene. You're standing or neck deep in fine ash, like a pit of sand. Then executioners start turning cranks that churn the ash into the air. A suffocating cloud of powder swirls up and fills your lungs. You can't breathe. You cough and inhale more burning ash into your throat. It's like drowning, but instead of water, it's dry cinders choking the life out of you. There are accounts of this being used to execute a high-ranking traitor in the ancient Persian Empire. It was a dramatic way to kill, almost ritualistic. There's symbolism too. Ashes to ashes, perhaps, as the person is quite literally buried and killed by ashes. Again, it's the kind of death designed to stick in the public's mind, to make anyone who hears of it think twice about defying the king. Persia was not alone in devising imaginative ends for its enemies. Let's take a detour to another part of the ancient world, the lands mentioned in biblical history. In ancient Judea, under certain interpretations of Mosaic law, some crimes were met with extremely severe penalties that went beyond the usual stoning or burning. A notorious example involves death by molten metal. According to later traditions, for crimes like incest or adultery under specific circumstances, the prescribed execution was to first strangle the convicted person with a rope, not to death, just to the brink. And then, when their mouth opened in a desperate gasp for air, molten lead or tin would be poured down their throat. Imagine the searing metal cascading into one's body, burning everything in its path from the inside. It's horrific to envision. The idea was that the sinner was burned for their sin, but from the inside out, as a sort of perverse twist on burning at the stake. How often this was actually carried out is hard to know, but just the fact that it existed as an idea is chilling enough. Meanwhile, in the Indian subcontinent, there were reports of yet another form of execution that leveraged the mighty power of animals. Several ancient kingdoms in South Asia trained elephants as executioners. Yes, elephants. These intelligent giants could be instructed by their mahouts, handlers, to kill a person in various ways, quickly or slowly. A well-trained execution elephant might slowly crush the limbs of a prisoner by pressing down with its foot, essentially torturing the person before a final lethal blow to the head or chest. Alternatively, the elephant might use its trunk to toss the person into the air or trample them outright. The mere idea of an enormous elephant looming over you, its massive foot coming down on your body, is terrifying. This method was not only brutally effective, but it also had a psychological impact on anyone who watched or heard about it. Imagine the strength of a king who could command such a beast to do his bidding. It sent a clear message of absolute power over man and nature. Even centuries later, European travelers and colonizers in Asia were shocked to witness or hear of executions by elephant. It left such an impression that the British in India later adopted the practice for dealing with mutineers during the colonial era. We'll touch on that again in a later chapter. The use of animals in punishments wasn't unique to elephants either. Elsewhere, we will see humans being fed to lions in Roman arenas, or snakes and dogs employed in exotic tortures. In Persia, it was said that one king executed a criminal by having him torn apart by wild animals as a spectacle. What we see across all these ancient empires, Assyrian, Persian, Hebrew, Indian, is that extreme punishments often flourished in societies where rulers claimed divine authority or absolute power. They carried a sense of drama and dread. Punishment was not merely a legal consequence, it was a performance, a statement. Whether it was a public impalement outside city walls, a man slowly eaten by insects in a boat, or an execution under the foot of an elephant, the goal was to instill an almost supernatural fear. If you were a subject of these empires, you learned from a young age that the king's justice spared no one and could take on forms that haunted your nightmares. By today's standards, these methods are unbelievably cruel. It's hard to imagine living in a society where such things not only happened, but were sometimes normalized as the way justice worked. Yet, for the people of those eras, it was part of the social fabric. If anything, they might have found our modern prisons and attempts at humane punishment puzzling, or even weak. They believed fear of pain and death was the strongest deterrent against disobedience, and so they wielded it liberally. As we conclude this chapter on the ancient empires, take a moment to absorb the sheer scale of suffering that was once deemed justice. The empires of old achieved great things: the building of cities, roads, the creation of art and literature. But their legacy has this very dark shadow. They show us that human creativity isn't limited to art and science. It unfortunately extends to finding ever more terrible ways to hurt one another. In the next chapter, we will move on to the classical world of the Greeks and Romans. These civilizations are often praised as the foundation of Western culture, known for philosophy, democracy, and law. But their approach to punishment had its own share of nightmares. From the famed crucifixions of Rome to ingenious torture devices dreamt up in legend, prepare to see how even the cradle of democracy and empire was not above spilling blood in extraordinarily cruel ways. Chapter 3: Classical Carnage, Pain and Punishment in Greece and Rome. Now we step into the classical world, the age of ancient Greece and Rome. These civilizations gave us philosophy, drama, and law, but they also had their own arsenal of punishments, some straightforwardly brutal, others fiendishly inventive. If you wandered the marble cities of Greece or the mighty roads of the Roman Empire, you would find that justice could be as deadly and public as anywhere else. Let's start with an infamous invention from the Greek world, the brazen bull of Sicily. The story behind it almost sounds like a dark myth. According to legend, a Greek metalworker named Perilos presented a new execution device to Phalaris, the tyrant of the city of Akragas. This device was a life-size hollow bronze statue of a bull. The condemned person would be locked inside the metal bull, and a fire lit underneath. As the bronze heated up, the person inside would slowly roast alive, essentially turned into a human oven roast. To top off the cruelty, the bull was designed with a system of pipes in its nostrils or mouth. When the victim inside screamed in agony, the sound would be converted into something like the bellowing of an angry bull. One can imagine the horrifying spectacle: a bull figuratively coming alive, groaning with the distorted cries of the dying person within, while the smell of burning flesh wafted out. The twist to this tale is that the tyrant Phalaris, upon seeing the brazen bull demonstrated, some accounts say Perilos wanted to show how the screams would sound, and made the mistake of climbing inside, was so appalled by the contraption's wickedness that he decided to give Perilos a taste of his own invention. Phalaris allegedly had Perilos thrown into the bull and lit the fire, making him the device's first victim. Whether that part is true or not, it's recorded that Phalaris himself eventually met his end in a revolt, and according to later legend, he too was executed in his own bull. It's a macabre tale that illustrates a broader point. The ancients were fully capable of creating complex torture devices purely for execution. And even among them, sometimes there was a sense that a line had been crossed, hence the tyrant turning the bull on its creator. Moving from the Greek Isles to the heart of the Roman Empire, we find what might be the most famous execution method of all time: crucifixion. The Romans did not invent crucifixion. It likely originated with earlier cultures like the Persians or Carthaginians, but they embraced it with a fervor unparalleled, using it as a punishment primarily for slaves, rebels, and the worst criminals, basically anyone they considered beneath the dignity of a quick death. If you were a Roman citizen, you were generally exempt from this fate, with a few notorious exceptions. But if you were not, crucifixion was the empire's way of saying, "This person is utterly crushed by Rome." So what was crucifixion really like? It was not the simple nailing to a cross that many depictions show. It was an ordeal. First, the condemned was usually flogged savagely with a whip. The Romans used a flagrum, often embedded with metal or bone bits to tear flesh. The prisoner, already bleeding and weakened, was forced to carry the heavy wooden crossbeam, called a patibulum, through the public streets to the execution site. This was like a final humiliating parade. Onlookers could mock or throw things at the condemned. Upon reaching the site, typically a hill or well-traveled area outside the city, the victim was affixed to the cross. Sometimes nails were driven through the wrists or forearms and feet. Other times ropes were used to tie the person up. The cross, or sometimes just a pole or tree, would then be raised upright, leaving the person hanging. Death by crucifixion was intentionally slow and agonizing. Despite the nails or ropes, the real killer was often asphyxiation. Hanging by the arms makes it terribly hard to breathe. The condemned would writhe and push up with their legs, if they weren't nailed at the feet, to gasp for air until they were too exhausted to continue. It could take many hours or even days for someone to die on the cross. Exposure, dehydration, and sheer pain all played their part. In some cases, executioners would hasten death by breaking the person's legs with a mallet so they could no longer push up to breathe, thereby quickening suffocation. In other cases, especially if they wanted to prolong suffering, they would do the opposite. Make sure not to damage any vital areas so that the person lingered. It was, in short, a torture and an execution rolled into one, played out as a public spectacle. We usually think of one very famous crucifixion in Judea around 33 AD, an event that became central to a world religion. Indeed, that event highlights just how common this method was for the Romans. They executed thousands by crucifixion. Another infamous episode occurred around 71 BC, after a massive slave rebellion in Italy led by Spartacus was crushed. As a warning to anyone who might dream of defiance, the Roman general Crassus ordered 6,000 captured rebels to be crucified along the Appian Way, the main road to Rome. 6,000 crosses lined the roadside, stretching for miles, each bearing a dying or dead man. It is almost impossible to fathom the horror of that sight for travelers. Roman writers recorded it precisely because it was meant to leave an indelible impression. This is what happens to those who challenge Rome's authority. Crucifixion remained a standard punishment until the 4th century AD, when Emperor Constantine, having adopted Christianity, which viewed the cross with a very different sentiment by then, finally banned it. But for centuries, it was the ultimate symbol of Roman power over the body. The Romans had many other punishments too. For parricide, the crime of killing one's parent, the Romans devised a curious and symbolic execution called poena culae, the punishment of the sack. If you were convicted of murdering a parent, they wouldn't just kill you. They'd tie you up in a leather sack and toss you into a river or sea. But you wouldn't be alone in that sack. Along with you, they would often place a menagerie of live animals. A dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster were traditional. The thrashing of the terrified animals, biting and clawing, coupled with your own panic, made for a chaotic scene inside that sack. The symbolism was perhaps a kind of cosmic chaos. By killing your parent, you had upended the natural order, so you were cast into the water literally with nature, in the form of animals, to be torn apart and drowned. It's a strangely theatrical way to execute someone, blending animal punishment with human punishment. Speaking of animals, the Romans also had the infamous damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to the beasts. This was a form of execution, typically reserved for entertainment in the arena. Criminals, prisoners of war, or early Christian martyrs, among others, might be thrown into an arena with wild animals such as lions, tigers, bears, or even packs of wild dogs. Crowds would cheer as the beasts tore the condemned to pieces. Sometimes it wasn't instant. Romans could be quite stage managing with these executions, maybe wounding a person slightly or tying them to a stake to make the kill easier for the animal and more drawn out for the spectacle. The purpose was twofold: to punish in the most degrading way. Being eaten alive in front of tens of thousands is as degrading as it gets, and to entertain the masses. It's almost unbelievable to us that families once spent their weekends watching people get mauled by lions for fun. But such was the culture of the Roman gladiatorial games. On the more strictly military side of things, Rome also enforced discipline with terrifying penalties. If a Roman soldier showed cowardice or desertion, he might face fustuarium, basically being beaten to death by his fellow soldiers with clubs and stones. The entire unit would participate in killing the disgraced soldier, a grim team-building exercise to ensure everyone understood the price of failure. And then there was decimation, used in extreme cases of mutiny or cowardice by an entire unit. Decimation meant that a unit of soldiers, say one cohort, about 480 men, would be split into groups of 10. In each group, lots were drawn, and one unlucky soldier out of 10 was marked for death. The other 9 soldiers in that group were then required to execute their comrade, again, usually by beating him to death or stabbing. This way, even loyal or brave soldiers might find themselves killing a companion due to the failings of their unit as a whole. Decimation was rare, but when it happened, it sent shockwaves of terror through the army ranks. Imagine surviving a battle only to have to kill your friends or be killed by them as punishment for the unit's disgrace. The psychological impact must have been devastating. Not all Roman punishments were about immediate death, by the way. They also used forms of slavery and hard labor as punishment, like being condemned to the galleys, rowing ships until you died, or sent to mines, which was essentially a slow death sentence. But since we're focusing on the disturbing truth of methods themselves, let's not forget that even the absence of a quick death could be a punishment. To be worked to death or to slowly waste away in a mine or dungeon was another flavor of horror. Meanwhile, what about the Greeks beyond the brazen bull? The Greek city-states, like Athens, generally had simpler methods. Common executions were poison, as in the famous case of Socrates, who drank hemlock, or simple beheading. They didn't go in for the gore as much as some others. However, there are stories like that of the Spartan tyrant Nabis, who, according to one ancient historian, had a peculiar torture device. He reportedly constructed a life-size mechanical replica of his wife, the queen, called the iron apaga. This automaton was said to be covered in iron spikes and could give a deadly embrace. Nabis would force wealthy citizens who defied him to hug this spiked figure. Once they were in its clutches, he would tighten the machine's embrace, impaling his victim. It was both theatrical and brutal, a cruel joke in a way, using the image of a loving hug as a means to kill. How true is that story? It's hard to say. Sometimes ancient historians like to spice up tales of tyrants to make them seem more evil. But it certainly fits with the theme that even in the classical world, creative torture was not unheard of. From the grandeur of the Roman Colosseum to the tyrants of Greece, the classical age shows us that knowledge and refinement in other areas did not stop the use of horrific punishments. In fact, civilizations seem to sometimes just provide a bigger stage and more spectators for the suffering. The Romans, with their engineering prowess, built arenas and crosses. The Greeks, with their clever minds, concocted stories or devices to inflict pain. Before we leave the classical era, there is one more notorious punishment to mention, one that combines execution with spectacle in a way that bridges myth and reality: the wicker man. Although this comes more from Roman accounts of Celtic tribes rather than Greco-Roman practice itself, it's worth noting, Julius Caesar, when writing about the Celtic Druids in Gaul, what is now France, claimed that they executed criminals by burning them alive inside giant woven wooden effigies shaped like humans or animals. These wicker men would be filled with victims and then set ablaze as a massive sacrifice, perhaps to their gods. Some modern historians question whether this was exaggerated propaganda by the Romans to depict the Celts as savages. But even the idea of it is haunting. Imagine a towering figure made of twigs and branches, thrashing silhouettes of people inside as flames consume it. It goes to show that from the perspective of one culture, Rome, the cruel practices of another, the Celts, were catalogued and marveled at, even while Rome was doing equally ghastly things in its own arenas. Cruelty, it seems, is a universal human trait, not confined to one people or one time. As we move on, our next chapter will dive into the so-called Dark Ages and medieval period. If you think humanity might have become more enlightened after the fall of Rome, think again. In some ways, the Middle Ages took cruelty to new heights or depths, blending fervent religious zeal with imaginative tortures. Brace yourself as we enter an era of witch hunts, inquisitions, and castles with dungeons that hide terrible secrets. Chapter 4: Medieval Nightmares, Justice in the Dark Ages. The fall of Rome didn't bring an end to cruelty. In fact, the early and high Middle Ages in Europe, often called the Dark Ages for a reason, saw their own blend of harsh justice, now often intertwined with fervent religious zeal. life was tough. Law was often local and arbitrary, and punishments aimed not only to chastise, but also to save souls, or so it was believed. In medieval Europe, the idea persisted that fear of punishment was key to maintaining order, just as in ancient times. But now, there was an added element: the notion that some punishments could purify a sinner or protect the community from God's wrath. This led to some truly harrowing practices. One concept unique to the medieval mindset was the trial by ordeal. If a person was accused of a crime and there wasn't clear evidence, instead of a jury trial like we might have today, they could be subjected to a dangerous test, essentially asking God to reveal the truth through a miracle. There were many kinds of ordeals. You might have to plunge your hand into boiling water and retrieve a stone, then have your scalded arm wrapped up for a few days. If, when unwrapped, your burns were healing cleanly, you were deemed innocent by divine intervention. If they festered, you were guilty. In another common ordeal, a person might carry a red-hot iron bar a certain distance. Again, the healing of the burns was the sign of innocence or guilt. Then, there was the ordeal of cold water. The accused would be tied up and thrown into a pond. Water was considered pure, so the thought was, if the water accepted you, meaning you sank, you were innocent. If you bobbed to the surface, the water was rejecting you due to your sin, and you were guilty. It was a lose-lose scenario in many cases. Sink, and you might drown, though they'd often pull you out before death, hopefully. Float, and you'd be executed for whatever you were accused of. This particular water ordeal became notorious during witch trials in later centuries, the infamous witch swimming tests, but its origins were medieval. The disturbing truth here is that life and death sometimes hung on such superstitious gambles, essentially random or rigged tests, rather than any real evidence. For those straightforwardly found guilty, or who failed an ordeal, punishments in medieval times ranged widely. Public shaming was common for minor offenses. Imagine being locked in the stocks or the pillory in the town square. These were wooden devices that clamped down on your ankles or neck and wrists, immobilizing you. The whole town could see you and would often ridicule you, throw rotten food or even stones at you. It was humiliating and could be painful. Some people died in the pillory when things got out of hand and the crowd pelted them too enthusiastically with rocks or bricks. The idea was to shame you and deter others, and it appealed to the community's sense of justice. Everyone got to participate a little in punishing the wrongdoer. Then there were corporal punishments, physical mutilations, for those the authorities wanted to mark permanently. A thief might get his hand cut off. A liar or a blasphemer might have his tongue cut out. In some places, coin forgers, counterfeiters, were boiled alive in oil or water, literally stewing the fraudsters as a message to others not to tamper with the currency. If that sounds extreme, it's because it was. Medieval kings didn't take kindly to people meddling in the economy or their authority. For many crimes, especially serious ones like murder, arson, or treason, execution was the go-to punishment. But even among executions, there were degrees of horror. Hanging was very common. A good old hanging from the gallows was considered relatively standard. Often, it wasn't the quick neck snap drop through a trapdoor we think of in later centuries. Medieval hangings might involve simply hauling the person up on a rope or ladder and letting them slowly strangle. Crowds would gather on execution day like it was a fair. Vendors might sell meat pies or ale, making a macabre picnic out of watching someone die. Yet, as grim as a simple hanging is, medieval Europe devised worse for the worst offenders. High treason, essentially acts that threatened the crown or state, was considered the most vile crime, and it earned the most vile punishment. In England and some other places, this evolved into the penalty of hanging, drawing, and quartering. It's a bit of a mouthful, but each part of that phrase is a stage in an exceptionally cruel process. Let me paint the scene by recounting the fate of one of medieval England's most famous traitors, at least in the eyes of the English crown. Sir William Wallace of Scotland. Yes, the very one immortalized in the film Braveheart. In 1305, Wallace was captured and sentenced to this punishment. First, he was drawn, not as in sketched on paper, but drawn through the streets. He was tied behind a horse and dragged over the cobbled roads of London from his prison to the place of execution. The rough journey, over several miles, would have left him battered and bleeding, and this was amidst a jeering crowd that pelted him with garbage and waste. By the time he arrived at Smithfield, where the execution was to happen, he was already in agony. Then came the hanging. Wallace was hoisted up by the neck to be hanged, but crucially, they did not let him hang to death. This was a half-hanging, enough to choke him and cause terrible pain, perhaps render him unconscious, but not to kill him. They wanted him alive for what came next. Cut down from the gallows, alive but barely, Wallace then suffered the next horrifying step. He was drawn and quartered, which in this context means disemboweled and dismembered. The executioner sliced open his abdomen and began pulling out his intestines, right there in front of the crowd. Some accounts say these organs were burned in a fire as he watched. In reality, he would likely have lost consciousness at some point from shock or blood loss. But the idea was symbolically that the traitor's innards, the seat of his emotions and courage, were being destroyed before his very eyes. Wallace was emasculated as well, his genitals cut off. Ultimate humiliation and a way to ensure this man would have no posterity. Only after this unspeakable torment was he finally beheaded, granting a merciful end. But even in death, the punishment wasn't over. His body was cut into 4 pieces, quartered. His head and those quarters were sent to different parts of the kingdom. The head was placed on a spike on London Bridge, and other parts sent to places like Newcastle and Edinburgh to be displayed. This was so that even in far-flung corners, people would see the fate of the king's enemies. It's almost beyond comprehension, but this was not a one-off event. This punishment was the statutory penalty for male traitors in England for centuries. Women convicted of high treason were typically burned alive instead, for the sake of decency, as if that's any less cruel. The last known instance of hanging, drawing, and quartering in England took place in the late 18th century, believe it or not. Over all those years, countless individuals, famous or forgotten, experienced this fate. The rationale was that treason was an offense so heinous, it deserved a death that was not only physically excruciating, but also publicly demeaning and memorable. To us, it is medieval barbarity at its worst. Another notorious punishment of the Middle Ages, often fueled by religious fervor, was burning at the stake. Fire has a special place in human fear. It's painful, purifying in a spiritual sense, and very final. During the medieval period and into the early modern era, being burned alive was the chosen execution method for those accused of heresy, holding beliefs contrary to the church, or witchcraft. The idea was that fire would cleanse the sin and also serve as a dramatic warning to others. Heresy was seen not just as a personal sin, but as a contagious plague that could damn communities. So it was stamped out with fire and fury. Think of the image, a wooden stake erected in a town square or atop a hill, the condemned tied to it, a pyre of wood piled around their feet. At the appointed time, the wood is lit. The flames grow, first lapping at feet and legs, then rising higher. Smoke billows. The person might scream prayers or pleas or, as recorded in some cases, defiantly shout their convictions until the smoke chokes them. A crowd stands around watching, some in grim silence, others perhaps even cheering if they truly believe they're witnessing the destruction of evil. It could take many, many minutes for death to come, through inhalation of smoke if you were lucky, or through the flames themselves charring the body. One of the most famous victims of this was Joan of Arc, the French teenage heroine who led armies against the English. After being captured, she was tried as a heretic and witch, in part for claiming to hear divine voices and for wearing men's clothing, believe it or not. In 1431, in Rouen, she was burned at the stake. Witnesses say, even as the flames consumed her, she kept calling out the name of Jesus, until finally a merciful guard constructed a small cross and held it up for her to see as she died. Her ashes were then scattered in a river to prevent anyone from keeping relics. While Joan's name lives on as a saint and martyr, her trial was later debunked and she was declared innocent, but far too late. Thousands of less famous men and women met the same fiery fate in that era, accused of witchcraft, heresy, or sometimes even petty crimes like sodomy or counterfeiting, depending on local laws. The Inquisition, which began in the 13th century, is something we must touch on, as it institutionalized torture and execution for religious crimes. Church inquisitors were sent to investigate communities for heretics. Those accused would be interrogated, often under torture. We will explore the torture method soon in the next chapter. The final step for the unrepentant or the relapsed heretics was execution, and burning was the preferred method. The infamous Spanish Inquisition later, in the 15th to 16th centuries, followed similar patterns: torture to elicit confessions, then execution or harsh penance. It wasn't only heretics. Even beyond the religious sphere, being burned alive was sometimes used for other crimes, like the aforementioned high treason for women. The logic twisted itself into saying it was more modest than dismembering a woman's body publicly, so better to burn her clothed at a stake. A grim mercy. We also see in medieval times a flourishing of punitive creativity. Take, for example, the nasty practice of gibbeting. If an executed criminal, say a highway robber or pirate, needed to be made an example of, the authorities might place the corpse in an iron cage and hang it from a gibbet, gallows, by the roadside or harbor. The body would rot on display, sometimes for years, as a warning. In some cases, if they were particularly cruel, they might gibbet someone while still alive, leaving them to die of thirst or exposure in the cage. This was less common but certainly feared. Imagine traveling and coming upon a creaking iron cage in the breeze, a human skeleton or decomposing body inside, swinging gently. It was the Middle Ages billboard, a very graphic one that said, "Crime doesn't pay." For all the darkness of medieval punishment, there's also the interesting fact that some societies in this period did attempt less brutal forms at times. Fines, penance, even exile were used too. But somehow, the stories and methods that really linger in our imagination are the gruesome ones, and for good reason. They show a side of humanity that is hard to look at, the willingness to cause unbearable pain in the name of justice, order, or God. As we move into the later medieval period and the Renaissance, you'd think enlightenment would bring more humanity. But often it simply brought more efficiency or even more flamboyance in punishment. New devices were invented, and torture as an art form, if we can call it that, reached a zenith. In the next chapter, we'll enter the dungeons and torture chambers to see the contraptions and techniques that made the medieval and early modern period infamous for pain. Steel yourself, no pun intended, for the racks, wheels, and iron maidens that await. Chapter 5. The Tools of Torture, Inquisitors and Ingenious Devices. By the late medieval and into the Renaissance period, the art of torture and execution had in some ways become even more refined, if we can use that word. This was the era of dungeons, inquisitions, and public executions that doubled as grim theater. In this chapter, we descend into the torture chamber and examine some of the notorious devices and methods that have become synonymous with medieval cruelty. Walking into a torture chamber of the 15th or 16th century, you might see an array of instruments laid out or hanging on the walls, each designed to inflict pain in a particular way. The very sight would be enough to send shivers down one's spine, which was exactly the point. The threat of torture was often as important as torture itself for interrogators hoping to extract confessions. One of the simplest yet most effective torture devices was the rack. This was essentially a large wooden frame with rollers at each end. The victim would be laid on it, arms tied to the roller at one end, legs to the other. When the interrogators turned a crank, the rollers would pull the ropes, gradually stretching the person's body. First the joints would strain, then dislocate with painful popping sounds. Shoulders, elbows, hips, knees. If continued, limbs could be literally torn from their sockets. The rack's pain was excruciating, and it had the psychological effect of making the victim feel like their body was coming apart, which, in a sense, it was. Many accused witches and heretics, as well as political prisoners, were introduced to the rack. Few could endure it without confessing to whatever their torturers wanted to hear, which of course casts great doubt on any confessions obtained this way, but at the time that mattered less than the immediate goal of silencing dissent or rooting out devilry. Another fearsome implement was the strappado, often used by the Inquisition. This method was deceptively simple. The victim's hands were bound behind their back, and they were hoisted into the air by a rope tied to their wrists. Then, usually, they were dropped in a controlled way, not to the ground, but to a point where the rope stopped suddenly short, perhaps just a few feet lower. This sudden jerk, with arms behind, often caused shoulders to dislocate with agonizing effect. Sometimes weights were attached to the ankles to increase the force of the drop. The strappado left no external scars typically, besides rope burns, which for the torturers was useful. It meant the victim could potentially be tortured multiple times or displayed without obvious damage. But internally, the damage was done. Ripped muscles, nerves, and dislocated joints ensured long-lasting pain. Moving on to more grisly devices, there was the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel. Unlike the rack which stretched a body, the breaking wheel was used to systematically shatter a person's limbs. The victim would be tied down, and a heavy wagon wheel, sometimes with metal rim or studs, would be slammed down onto their arms and legs, breaking the bones. Alternatively, the person might be lashed to a wheel and beaten with an iron bar through the spokes. In some executions, after breaking the limbs, the broken body would be woven through the wheel's spokes and hoisted up on a pole as a morbid display. The person might still be alive, left to die slowly of shock or dehydration in that state. The breaking wheel was a common execution method in Europe for centuries, especially for murderers or bandits. It was recorded as still in use in the 18th century in parts of Germany. Imagine the terror of not just being executed, but having each bone methodically smashed as a crowd watched. That was the reality for many unfortunates. Now, one of the most infamous devices that people often think of is the Iron Maiden, the tall iron cabinet shaped like a sarcophagus with interior spikes that pierce the victim when the doors close. It's a chilling image, being shut into a metal coffin full of spikes, punctured, and left to bleed out in silence. The curious truth, however, is that the Iron Maiden, as we commonly envision it, might never have been used in medieval times at all. Historians believe it was a later invention, perhaps put together in the 18th or 19th century as a museum exhibit, cobbled from medieval-style elements to create a shocking display. There's no solid record of an actual Iron Maiden being used in the Middle Ages. Nevertheless, the concept itself, whether mythical or not, has such a grip on our imagination that it's worth mentioning. The idea that someone could have been locked in a spiked box is a perfect symbol of how we view medieval torture: elaborate, cruel, and concealed away from sight. Real or not, people in the Middle Ages certainly had devices that were just as cruel. They just might not have looked like a fancy iron coffin. They had spiked chairs, for instance, where a naked victim would be bound to a seat covered in spikes and sometimes slowly pressed or roasted with fire underneath. They had cages where a person might be confined in painful positions. The absence of a genuine Iron Maiden doesn't let the era off the hook by any means. It had plenty of other ways to make one suffer. Consider the Judas cradle, a device claimed to be used particularly in the Spanish Inquisition's repertoire. The victim would be hoisted above a pointed pyramid-like seat and then lowered, so that the point, often wooden or metal, inserted into the victim's anus or vagina. The person's own weight would gradually impale them further onto the spike. It was slow and agonizing, and usually the victim was naked, which added to the humiliation. Sometimes weights were tied to the legs to speed the process and increase pain. Like the Iron Maiden, some debate exists about how often this was actually used, but even if it was rare or a later exaggeration, it shows the feared reputation of the Inquisition's tortures. Another stomach-churning torture was sawing. In a saw execution, the victim might be hung upside down so that blood keeps flowing to the brain, ensuring they stay conscious longer. And then executioners would take a long saw and literally saw the person in half, typically starting at the groin and working downwards. Due to being upside down, the person might remain alive until the saw reached the midsection or even chest. This method pops up in various historical records and legends, from ancient Persia to medieval Europe. It wasn't common, thankfully, but the fact it was done at all is horrifying. The creativity of torturers seemed boundless. There were devices like thumb screws, small vises to crush fingers or toes, the Spanish boot, iron or wooden contraptions used to crush legs, sometimes with wedges hammered in to pulverize the shins, heated metal pincers and tongs to rip out nails or flesh, and the pear of anguish, a pear-shaped metal gag inserted into the mouth or other orifices, then expanded by turning a screw, mutilating internally. Whether each of these was widely used or not, they all existed at least in design, and the fear of them was very real. Some tortures were psychological as well as physical. For instance, Chinese water torture, though often exaggerated in lore, involved dripping water onto a person's forehead at irregular intervals. It sounds benign, but the unpredictability and repetition supposedly could drive a person mad, especially if restrained for days. There's debate if that was actually used historically, but it's part of the panoply of torture mythology. And it wasn't just devices. Sometimes tortures were simple uses of elements. A victim could be dunked repeatedly in water, almost to drowning, an early form of waterboarding essentially. They could be exposed to extreme cold or heat. One nasty trick: bind a person and place a rag down their throat, then pour water endlessly so they feel they're drowning internally. Waterboarding's precursor. Or conversely, stuff a person into a barrel and only feed them milk and honey, which, as we saw with scaphism, leads to hideous effects with waste and vermin. Variations of scaphism-like tortures cropped up in different places. During religious witch hunts in the 16th and 17th centuries, alleged witches were often tortured to elicit confessions of their pact with the devil. They might be pricked with needles to find the so-called witch's mark that didn't feel pain, or swum in the water ordeal as earlier mentioned. Many confessed under the pain of torture to whatever fantastical sins their inquisitors demanded, feeding a frenzy that led to more burnings at the stake. It wasn't only the church-led processes. Secular rulers also employed torture eagerly for crimes like regicide, conspiracy, or just to punish enemies. In Italy, one notorious figure, Duke Galeazzo Maria Sforza of Milan in the 15th century, was said to enjoy devising new tortures, and his contemporary, the merciless Bernabo Visconti, whom we touched on earlier, reputedly delivered one of the longest, most drawn-out public tortures on record, called the Quaresima, Italian for 40 days. According to accounts, Visconti's victims, usually those who plotted against him, would endure a little bit of torture each day for 40 days. One day their eyes might be gouged out, another day their noses or ears cut off, another day a hand, then the other hand, then a foot, and so on, interspersed with flayings, stretchings on the rack, beatings on the wheel, you name it. Literally a tour of nearly every torture method available, stretched over an agonizing month and a half. Visconti reportedly allowed the victims a day of rest between sessions, possibly to ensure they didn't die too soon and to maximize their suffering. By the end of the Quaresima, the prisoner would finally be executed, if they hadn't expired already from infection or trauma. It's the kind of tale that sounds like a cruel fable, yet medieval chronicles swear it happened. Visconti was eventually deposed, but one wonders what nightmares haunted the people who had witnessed or heard of these spectacles. As we consider these instruments and methods, an unsettling question arises. Who carried out these acts? The answer is, someone had to. Professional executioners and interrogators existed. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, the executioner was both feared and somewhat ostracized. It was a necessary job, often handed down in families or given to criminals who had been pardoned in exchange for taking up the role. Executioners were paradoxically respected for their skills, a clean beheading, a well-run torture session, and reviled for their contact with death and suffering. Some executioners became famous, like France's Sanson family, who served during the 18th century, executing hundreds, including later, using the guillotine. These men often lived at the edge of society, literally sometimes outside city walls, because people feared being near those who dealt in death. But when the time came for punishment, everyone relied on their gruesome expertise. By the 17th and 18th centuries, a shift began. The Enlightenment brought new ideas. Maybe punishment shouldn't be about excessive cruelty. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria started arguing against torture and cruel executions, pointing out the moral and practical failures of such systems. Some countries began to scale back. Public disembowelments and burnings gradually gave way to simpler executions like hanging or beheading, which, by comparison, seemed almost humane. The guillotine, introduced in France in the late 1700s, was explicitly designed to make execution quick and less painful, though its adoption was partly to make execution equal for all classes, not drawn out for some and swift for others. But before we get to the end of this bloody era, we still have other corners of the world to explore where different but equally brutal punishment practices existed. While Europe was doing all this, places in Asia, the Middle East, and elsewhere had their own approaches, some ancient, some continuing, even into the modern age. In the next chapter, we will travel eastward and look at some of the notorious punishment methods from China, India, and beyond, including one of the most prolonged execution methods ever practiced, chillingly called death by 1,000 cuts. Chapter 6, Eastern Atrocities, Cruelty in the Far East. Cruel and unusual punishments were by no means a solely Western phenomenon. In the Far East, across centuries of imperial dynasties and ancient traditions, there arose methods of punishment that rivaled or even exceeded those in Europe in their brutality. In some cases, these practices endured well into the modern era, a stark reminder that the march of time doesn't always mean progress in humaneness. Let's begin in Imperial China, a civilization renowned for its art, philosophy, and innovation, but also, at times, for draconian legalism and harsh penalties. The Chinese legal tradition, especially under certain dynasties, formalized punishment in a system known as the 5 punishments for various crimes. These were progressive in severity, starting with lighter corporal punishments, like tattooing the face of a criminal or cutting off the nose, escalating to chopping off feet or castration, and ultimately the death penalty. What makes it chilling is that these punishments were codified. It was essentially a menu of mutilations and death for judges to choose from. For particularly egregious crimes, treason, rebellion, parricide, killing one's parent, mass murder, the Chinese reserved a fate notorious throughout the world, lingchi, commonly translated as death by 1,000 cuts. This method of execution was exactly what it sounds like. The condemned person was tied to a wooden post or frame in a public square. Then, the executioner proceeded to methodically slice the victim's body over and over, removing pieces of flesh in a predetermined sequence. Bits of arms, legs, chest, sometimes even slices of the cheeks, were cut away. The aim was to keep the person alive and conscious for as long as possible, prolonging the agony. After numerous cuts, perhaps not literally 1,000, but enough to be uncountable in the moment, a final lethal cut, often a stab to the heart or neck, would end the suffering, or in some accounts, the executioner would mercifully decapitate the victim at the end. Photographs taken in the early 1900s of an actual lingchi execution, one of the last in 1904, are among the most gruesome images imaginable. The prisoner's body in tatters, chunks removed, yet their face showing consciousness in the early shots. Lingchi had been used for many centuries, sources suggest as early as the 10th century, and was only abolished in 1905 when China moved to modernize its penal code. It was intended not only to kill, but to obliterate. In Chinese belief, having an intact body after death was important for the afterlife. To be torn apart in death was to be damned both in this life and beyond. So lingchi was a punishment on multiple levels: physical torment, psychological terror, and spiritual ruin. Equally dreaded in China was the so-called waist chop. Imagine being executed by a single swing of a heavy sword, but instead of a merciful beheading, the executioner targets your midsection. The body is cut in half at the waist. In Chinese history, this was another form of capital punishment employed at times. essentially slicing the person in two. One famous victim of the waist cut was a high-ranking official named lingchi, centuries ago during the Qin dynasty, around 208 BC. Ironically, lingchi was one of the architects of Qin law, but fell from favor. As punishment, he was subjected to the 5 punishments, mutilated step by step, and finally cut in two at the waist. It was said he was made to watch his entire family executed before his own gruesome end. This brings up another disturbing aspect of Eastern and many ancient punishments: collective punishment. In China, there was the concept of 9 familial exterminations, also called zuju or miezu, for those who committed the gravest treasons. If you were found guilty of plotting against the emperor, it wasn't just you who suffered. They would execute your entire family, parents, siblings, children, sometimes even more distant relatives, as well as possibly your teacher and your students, any ties that were considered important in Confucian society. The idea was to wipe out not just the traitor, but all his roots and branches, so nothing of his lineage remained to seek revenge. This horrific practice meant dozens of innocents might be put to death for one person's crime, often by methods like beheading or, in the worst cases, lingchi. As extreme as that sounds, it was carried out multiple times in Chinese history. For instance, in the 15th century, a Ming dynasty official named Fang Xiaoru so offended the new emperor Yongle that not only was Fang executed by lingchi, but reportedly all his kin were killed, supposedly extending to 10 degrees of kinship, which apocryphally included even his students. Fang Xiaoru himself defiantly refused to write an apology and was said to have declared, "Make it 9 familial exterminations. Why stop at 9? Make it 10. The angry emperor obliged by including Fang's students as that 10th group. Whether or not that detail is embellished, it reflects how absolute power could mete out absolute retribution. Across the sea in Japan, feudal times saw their share of cruel punishments too. One that stands out is an event rather than a method. After a Christian-led rebellion in Shimabara in 1637, the Tokugawa shogunate brutally suppressed it and executed an estimated 37,000 rebels and sympathizers. Many were crucified in the Japanese fashion. Yes, crucifixion was also used in Japan, often tying the victim to a cross and spearing them with lances, a punishment reserved for common criminals, as samurai had the privilege of seppuku, or ritual suicide. Others were beheaded or forced into the sea. The Japanese also employed boiling as an execution method at times. There's a recorded case of a thief in the 16th century being boiled alive in oil, a punishment that apparently so horrified a visiting European witness that it was written about as a sign of Japan's barbarity, though Europe was doing similar things at the time. Returning to India, we've already discussed how execution by elephants was a favored method in South and Southeast Asia. But another practice in India that shocks our modern sensibilities was the ritual of sati, the immolation of a widow on her husband's funeral pyre. Now, sati was more a cultural religious practice than a state-ordered punishment, but there were cases where widows were forced or pressured into it as a way of punishing what society saw as the misfortune or uselessness of a woman without her husband. Under this practice, when a married man died, his wife, sometimes willingly, sometimes under coercion, would burn herself alive on his burning funeral pyre. The act was supposed to display ultimate wifely devotion and ensure the couple entered the next life together. But from another angle, it was a way of disposing of widows who were often seen as a burden. British colonial officials in the 19th century, upon encountering sati, were aghast and outlawed it in territories they controlled. though it had already been declining and was never universal in India. Still, the idea of a society expecting a widow to die in such a horrific way, essentially a socially endorsed suicide or murder by fire, is a disturbing reminder that cruelty isn't always delivered by an executioner's blade. Sometimes it's woven into the social fabric. While on the subject of the subcontinent and surrounding regions, it's worth noting that even into the 20th century, some very old-school punishments were still occurring. As late as the 1800s, in Southeast Asia, there are reports of extremely gruesome royal executions. One account from Thailand, Siam, in the 19th century, describes a method for executing those who threatened the king. The condemned would be tied to a stake, and a trained elephant would literally rip them apart. The elephant was supposedly instructed to pull off the limbs or head of the victim. It's hard to say how often this was done versus being a story to scare people, but European observers at the time believed it. In the Middle East, a region with ancient civilizations and laws, many of the classical methods, stoning, impalement, flaying, were used at various times. For example, in Persia, Iran, we discussed scaphism. The Persians also have accounts of burying people alive as punishment, particularly under Persian king Cambyses, who buried 12 people upside down for minor crimes, according to Herodotus. In the Islamic context, the traditional Sharia law penalties for certain offenses could be very severe. Adulterers might be stoned to death. Thieves might have a hand amputated. The logic was religious and deterrent combined. While those punishments were codified, their actual usage varied widely across history and regions. Some rulers were lenient, others brutally strict. One particularly brutal punishment in the Islamic world's history took place under the Ottoman Empire's Sultan Mahmud II in the 1820s. After the Greeks rebelled, the Ottomans captured an entire island, Chios, and in retribution, they massacred tens of thousands of inhabitants, with some sources describing executions by beheading or impalement en masse. Additionally, the Ottomans were known at times to execute high-ranking prisoners by strangulation with a bowstring, a method considered more dignified, no spilling of blood, but still terrifying as a sudden and silent death. We'd be remiss not to mention that in many of these Eastern societies like China and Japan, there were also more regular forms of capital punishment akin to Europe's hangings or beheadings. The sword was often the execution tool of choice. In China, public beheadings were common for criminals. It was quick and effective, though as noted, the Chinese often considered decapitation a particularly shameful death, since it left the body separated. In Japan, the ritual suicide of seppuku, self-disembowelment followed by decapitation by a second, was a unique practice, not exactly a punishment inflicted by others, but a way for samurai to take their own life when they had been sentenced to death or felt extreme shame. If a samurai failed or betrayed his lord, rather than be executed like a common criminal, he might be given the option to die by seppuku to preserve some honor. Yet, this itself is a disturbing idea. A culture where you are expected to cut open your own belly as atonement. What we gather from looking east is that no culture, no matter how sophisticated or insulated by distance, avoided the impulse to use horrific punishments as tools of power, control, or supposed moral correction. The specifics might differ. One civilization might favor slicing, another burning, another crushing. But the underlying human capacity to inflict pain on wrongdoers, or those labeled as such, is universally present. One might ask, why dwell on these terrible practices? Beyond satisfying a morbid curiosity, they force us to confront what human beings have been capable of under certain conditions. They also highlight how authority and fear are often intertwined. Whether it was a Chinese emperor making an example of a traitor through lingchi, or a local village council in medieval Europe dunking a suspected witch, the aim was to reinforce power structures and social norms by spilling blood. As we leave the East, keep in mind that many of these customs persisted surprisingly late. As mentioned, China didn't abolish lingchi until the 20th century. In parts of the Middle East, some ancient methods like stoning still have been reported even into the 21st century in isolated cases. It's sobering to realize that the line between historical punishment and modern brutality is thinner than we'd like to think. Next, we will sail into the age of exploration and empires, the colonial era and the high seas, to see how punishments played out in new frontiers. This era introduces things like naval punishments and the blending of cultures and their cruelties, plus a few more bizarre and creative penalties that arose in the fervor of revolution and piracy. Chapter 7. Empires and Pirates. Punishments on the high seas and colonies. As we sail into the early modern period, roughly the 17th through 19th centuries, the world is expanding. European empires reach across the globe, and pirates roam the seas. One might think that with the Renaissance and Enlightenment, punishments would become gentler. In some cases they eventually did, but the journey to get there was paved with blood. In the colonial era and on the high seas, we see a clash of old brutal methods with new circumstances and even a few novel punishments born out of unique situations. Let's start with the maritime world, where discipline could be literally a matter of life and death. Life aboard naval vessels was harsh, and so were the penalties for disobedience. One infamous punishment in navies, particularly associated with the Dutch and later adopted by other navies, was keelhauling. Imagine a large wooden ship and a sailor accused of serious misconduct. The punishment? He is tied to a rope that loops beneath the ship from one side to the other. Then he's thrown overboard from one side of the bow, front of the ship, and dragged underwater along the hull to the other side, pulled by ropes across the barnacle-crusted bottom of the vessel. The barnacles are like razor-sharp rocks. They tear into the sailor's flesh as he's hauled under the ship's keel, hence keelhaul. If the journey itself doesn't drown him, and often it did, especially if the rope snagged or the sailor panicked, then the lacerations from the barnacles could be so severe that, if he survived, he'd carry scars all over his body for life. It was said some men emerged with their face unrecognizable, shredded by the sharp shells. Keelhauling was usually reserved for very serious offenses like mutiny or desertion attempts, and theoretically it wasn't always intended to be fatal. They might haul slowly or have doctors ready. But in practice, it was often a death sentence. The terror it evoked was enough to keep many a crew in line. Everyone understood that certain misdeeds could earn them a horrific dunk under the ship where the sun doesn't shine. Pirates, operating outside the law, had their own forms of punishment, both within their crews and inflicted on victims. A legendary pirate punishment, though perhaps more famous in fiction than common in reality, is walking the plank. This is the scenario where a captive or a mutinous crew member is forced to walk off a wooden plank extended over the side of a ship, plunging into the ocean, often bound so they cannot swim, thus drowning. While popular culture loves the image of a blindfolded prisoner taking that last step into the air, historical evidence for plank walking is actually scant. Pirates more often simply murdered or marooned their victims. But the fact that walking the plank has become iconic means it resonates with our understanding of pirate cruelty, a blend of casual murder and dark theatricality. It's the kind of thing pirates would do to amuse themselves, which is why it sticks, whether or not it was actually frequent. Now, marooning. That was very real. Pirates and navies alike used marooning as a punishment. A troublemaker or an unwanted captive would be left behind on a deserted island or a remote coast with little or no provisions. Essentially, it was a death sentence by abandonment. The victim might have a chance at survival if the island was hospitable and they were resourceful, but in most cases, it meant dying slowly of thirst, hunger, or exposure, utterly alone. For a pirate crew, marooning a member was the ultimate punishment for betrayal or attempted mutiny. It removed the person without bloodying the hands of their comrades, at least not directly. One famous case was that of pirate captain Edward England, who in 1720 was marooned by his own crew after a disagreement. He actually survived and lived as a beggar for a time. The isolation and despair that marooning inflicted made it a psychologically cruel method. Sometimes the threat of it was enough to quell dissent on a ship. Moving onto the colonial lands, especially in British-controlled territories, we encounter a punishment called blowing from a gun. This was notably used by the British in India during and after the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, though it had precedent in the region earlier. The condemned person would be tied to the mouth of a cannon back against the muzzle. Then the cannon was fired. In an instant, the body was obliterated by the blast. Eyewitness accounts describe the grisly result. The head might shoot off into the sky, limbs flung far distances, and nothing much left of the torso. It was a terrifying way to die, and from the executioner's perspective, a very effective way to prevent any possibility of remains becoming martyrs' relics, since the body was essentially in pieces. The British used this method publicly to send a message, especially against rebel sepoys, Indian soldiers. It said, "Not only will we kill you, but we will annihilate you." One contemporary observer noted how after the boom of the cannon, a silence would fall except for the patter of falling body parts returning to earth. It's a sickening image. Shockingly, blowing from a gun was not unique to the British. Earlier, various Indian princes and the Mughal Empire had used it as well for certain brutal executions. The practice continued sporadically into the 20th century. As late as 1930, a journalist reported its use in Afghanistan. So here we have an ancient concept, death by explosive force, still alive in modern times. Back in Europe and the Americas, even as the Enlightenment spread ideals of human rights, we had some grim episodes. Colonial America, for instance, isn't usually associated with torture. But during the Salem witch trials in 1692, an elderly man named Giles Corey was subjected to a form of torture called pressing. Corey refused to enter a plea when accused of witchcraft, perhaps hoping to avoid the trial altogether. According to law, a person who stood mute, refused to plead, could be coerced by peine forte dure, strong and hard punishment. Giles Corey was stripped nude, a board placed on his chest, and then rocks and weights piled on the board in an attempt to crush him into pleading. The sheriffs would periodically stand on the rocks to increase the pressure, asking him to plead. Corey, stubborn to the end, only gasped out, "More weight," rather than give in. The ordeal lasted 2, maybe 3 days as he was slowly squashed. He died under that pile of rocks, never having entered a plea. At that point, the authorities considered the matter closed, an awful loophole since by not pleading, technically, he hadn't been convicted, so his property was not confiscated by the government, which might have been his intention, to ensure his family inherited. His death, however, was agonizing and has gone down in history as a symbol of cruel justice during the witch hysteria. Another form of public humiliation and vigilante punishment during the American colonial and revolutionary era was tarring and feathering. A mob, angry at someone, often a tax collector or loyalist to the British, would seize the victim, strip them to the waist, pour hot tar over their body, and then dump feathers over them so they stuck. The unfortunate person, coated in sticky tar and feathers like some monstrous bird, would then be paraded around or chased out of town. It was usually not intended to be lethal, but it was terribly painful. Hot tar causes severe burns, and removing the tar afterward could tear away skin and hair. The aim was to publicly mark and shame someone, leaving them in pain and humiliation. While it might sound almost comical in imagery, to be on the receiving end was no joke. There are records of tarring and feathering throughout the 18th and even 19th centuries in the US, often as extrajudicial punishment by communities against individuals they hated. Now, even as these cruel acts were happening, the winds of change were blowing. The late 1700s saw growing discomfort with overtly torturous punishments among philosophers and even some rulers. A watershed moment that symbolized the old world of punishment took place in France in 1757. A man named Robert François Damiens had attempted to assassinate King Louis XV. His punishment was a last gasp of medieval-style spectacle. Damiens was tortured and executed in a way that horrified even those accustomed to brutality. He was first subjected to agonizing tortures in the Bastille, hot pincers tearing at his flesh, molten lead and boiling oil poured into his wounds. Then, in a public square, his limbs were tied to 4 strong horses, which were driven to literally tear him apart, a traditional drawing and quartering by horses. The process was ghastly and didn't go smoothly. It took an appallingly long time for the horses to dismember him. They were not used to pulling bodies apart, so extra hands had to help sever some sinews. When finally his body was torn into pieces, what remained was thrown into a fire and burned to ashes. Many in the crowd were sickened. This execution was widely reported and can be seen as a catalyst of sorts. Within a few decades, France abolished torture and introduced the guillotine, a device explicitly meant to execute efficiently and relatively painlessly. The guillotine, an instrument that came to symbolize a more modern form of capital punishment. It was basically a sharp-angled blade dropped from height, beheading the victim instantly. Dr. Joseph Guillotin proposed its use in 1789, believing it to be more humane and equal. No more special quick deaths for nobility and painful ones for commoners. Everyone would lose their head the same way. During the French Revolution's reign of terror, 1793 to 94, the guillotine certainly ran red, claiming thousands of lives. As grim as that was, one could argue that at least those people did not suffer the prolonged agony of the tortures we've been discussing. A small consolation, but a notable shift in attitude. Punishment was becoming less about maximizing pain and more about swift certainty, at least in official policy. Meanwhile, in the British Empire, by the 19th century, reforms were kicking in. Public executions continued into the mid-1800s, but torture was largely abandoned. The last instances of things like gibbeting a body in a cage occurred around the 1830s. For example, the notorious English pirate Captain William Kidd's body was gibbeted over the River Thames for years after his execution in 1701, but a century later, that practice had died out. On the other side of the world, however, in some colonies and frontiers, summary and brutal justice still popped up. Lynchings in the American West, for instance, bypassed any trial. A mob might just hang a person from the nearest tree. The methods could be crude but effective in delivering death. As we see, the colonial and early modern periods were a patchwork. In some cities of Europe, you had enlightened discussion about banning torture. In others, and in colonies, you still had people blown apart by cannons or dismembered by horses. It was a time of transition, and on the seas and edges of empires, where law could be more ruthless, some of the old ways persisted longer than in the refined courtrooms of Paris or London. The stage is set now for the final part of our journey, reflecting on how these gruesome practices finally came to mostly end and what legacy they left. Before we conclude, we'll take a brief look at some of the oddest, almost quirky punishments from history that we haven't covered yet, the ones that make you shake your head as much as cringe, and then talk about the eventual decline of cruel punishments. Chapter 8. Bizarre and Barmy. Unusual punishments on the lighter side. Not every punishment in history was about blood and death. Some were strange, even darkly comical by today's eyes, aiming more to embarrass or discomfort than to maim or kill. Let's look at a few of these odd punishments that show the creativity or absurdity of our ancestors in dealing out justice. In the 19th century United States, during the War of 1812, an American officer named Henry Dearborn employed a peculiar disciplinary measure in his barracks: riding the whirligig. The whirligig was essentially a large wooden cage mounted to a central post, like a giant hamster wheel or merry-go-round. A soldier sentenced to this punishment would be placed inside the cage, and then the device would be spun rapidly. Around and around they'd go, gathering speed, the hapless occupant tossed and rattled as the world blurred. Soldiers who experienced the whirligig would often emerge bruised, disoriented, and sometimes even with broken bones or a concussion if they were thrashed particularly hard against the cage. It was a form of humiliating spectacle as well, watching a grown man pinwheeling helplessly made for a memorable deterrent to others. What's more, there were reports that some men who endured prolonged whirligig rides developed lasting vertigo or mental distress. It's a reminder that you don't always need blades or fire to torture someone. Sometimes, a nauseating spin in a cage will do the trick. Another odd punishment took place under the blazing sun of the Caribbean. In 17th and 18th century Jamaica, there was a method for executing pirates known as gibbeting in the sun, or the drying cage. Captured pirates might be taken to a small rocky island just off the coast. Dead Man's Cay was one such place, and locked in an iron cage hung atop a high post. And then they were just left there. The tropical sun would beat down mercilessly. With no food or water, the condemned would succumb to thirst and heat within a couple of days. The cage was intentionally sized so that the person could not really sit or lie comfortably. It was pure agony as the body cramped and weakened. After death, the pirate's corpse would remain caged until it withered to a skeleton under the sun and salt breeze, a grisly scarecrow warning to other would-be buccaneers. This is similar to the gibbets we mentioned earlier for highwaymen in Europe, but the addition of the Caribbean climate made it a distinct form of suffering, essentially death by exposure and dehydration in a metal coffin roasting under the sun. Shame and public humiliation have long been tools of punishment, especially for moral or religious offenses. In Scotland, for example, adulterers, or those who violated church norms, might face time on the repentance stool. This wasn't a torture device per se, but a form of enforced public humiliation. The repentance stool was placed prominently in a church during service. The guilty party, say someone caught in infidelity, would be made to sit or stand on this stool. often wearing sackcloth or special shame garments, in front of the whole congregation. The minister and community would scold and heckle them as part of the service. Imagine the mortification of standing before your entire town while they enumerate your sins and you're visibly marked as a wrongdoer. In small communities, reputation was everything, so this could feel like a social death. The repentant stool was an official punishment in some churches into the 18th century, with records of it being used even later informally. It shows that not all punishments relied on physical pain. Psychological and social pain could be just as powerful. Across Europe, a variety of shame masks and contraptions were also used. For instance, a scold's bridle, also called a branx, was a device employed in England and Scotland for nagging or gossiping women. Essentially, women who talked too much or too sharply. It was like an iron cage that fit over the head, with a bit or plate that went into the mouth to press down the tongue. When locked in place, the woman could not speak, or if she tried, the bridle's bit would inflict pain on her tongue or mouth. Sometimes these bridles even had bells on them, or animal-like muzzles, adding to the humiliation when the poor woman was paraded through town. It's horrifying to think about. Expressing an opinion too freely could land someone in a muzzle like an animal, jangling bells to draw mockery from neighbors. Yet, this was considered an appropriate remedy for a scolding wife in certain communities a few hundred years ago. In Germany and other parts of Europe, there were shame cloaks, or barrel punishments. A drunkard's cloak was one notorious example. A person who was habitually drunk and causing a public nuisance might be made to wear a barrel, with holes for the head and arms, and parade around town. This wooden barrel outfit, heavy and ridiculous looking, served as both immobilization and humiliation. The person inside would be hot, uncomfortable, and utterly shamed as people laughed at the walking barrel. It was basically a one-person stocks on the go. Now, for a punishment that sounds almost silly, but was reportedly effective, goat-licking torture. This was used in medieval Europe in some instances to extract confessions in a way that didn't leave marks. The victim's feet would be imprisoned in stocks, and their bare soles would be covered in heavily salted water. Then a goat, which loves salt, would be brought in to enthusiastically lick the person's feet. If you've ever been licked by a cat or have felt a goat's tongue, you know it's not soft. A goat's tongue is quite rough, almost like sandpaper. The sensation starts as intensely ticklish. Victims were said to laugh uncontrollably at first. But the goat doesn't stop. It keeps licking to get the salt. The tickling becomes torment. Imagine being unable to move your feet as the abrasive tongue keeps stimulating the raw nerve endings. Eventually, it's said the skin could even be worn away, leading to bleeding and extreme pain. All the while, the method doesn't carry the dramatic viscerality of, say, the rack or thumb screws, but it can be psychologically deranging. Tickle torture is a very real form of torment, and physically harmful over time. It's an offbeat example of how anything, even a goat, could become an instrument of torture with a bit of human creativity. The Chinese kang, mentioned earlier, also fits into this category of non-lethal but harsh punishment. Picture a large, heavy wooden yoke or collar, kind of like the stocks but portable. It locked around a person's neck, often weighing 20, 30, even 50 pounds. The boards were so large that the person could not reach their own face, meaning they couldn't feed themselves. Often, the offense would be written on the kenge for all to see: thief or tax evader, or whatever shameful act had been committed. The convict might be sentenced to wear this kenge for weeks, shuffling around and relying on the kindness of others to give them food or water. It was a form of public advertisement of one's crime and a test of endurance. The heavy boards caused painful sores on the shoulders and neck, and the isolation and helplessness added a psychological dimension. One could see these unfortunate souls in the streets of Qing Dynasty China, heads bowed under enormous planks, serving their time in literal wooden bondage. It's somewhat analogous to the European use of pillory in stocks, a way to punish by discomfort and disgrace rather than execution or permanent injury. As odd as some of these punishments sound, they all speak to a common thread: using the community as an enforcer. Many bizarre punishments were carried out in public and relied on people's ridicule or outrage to amplify the pain, whether it was wearing a donkey's ears hat in medieval carnivals as a fool, or being forced to literally ride the rail, straddling a fence rail carried by two men, which could cause serious groin injuries, a punishment used by mobs in early America for troublemakers. The community's participation made it impactful. It's almost a relief to talk about these versus the tortures of previous chapters, because at least here, the intention was often to avoid maiming or killing. They aimed to correct behavior through shame and short-term suffering. However, they still remind us how far the definition of acceptable punishment has evolved. Today, making someone wear a sign listing their crime might be the most we see of this, and even that is controversial. Whereas a few hundred years ago, you might literally be wearing an iron mask with a tongue spike for nagging your husband too much. Now, with this peculiar detour through the bizarre side of punishment behind us, let's step back and look at the big picture one more time. It's time to reflect on what all these methods, from the horrific to the merely humiliating, tell us about humanity and how, by and large, we've moved away from them, thankfully, in modern times. Chapter 9. Conclusion. Reflections in the aftermath. We've journeyed through thousands of years of human history, seeing some of the darkest capabilities of human nature. It's been a long and winding road of pain, from the eye-for-an-eye retributions of ancient Babylon, to the theatrical torture fests of medieval Europe, to the far-flung horrors in Asia and the high seas. By now, you might be feeling a mix of shock, gratitude, and sorrow. Shock at what has been done, gratitude that most of these practices are history, and sorrow for the countless lives that endured such fates. The disturbing truth about historical punishment methods is not just that they existed, but that they were often accepted, even celebrated, by society in their time. Public executions were community events. Elaborate tortures were legal processes. Good, upstanding citizens of centuries past took their children to watch someone burn alive or be dismembered, and they believed it was righteous. That is perhaps the most unsettling realization, how normal it once was. So, what changed? Over the last few centuries, a wave of reform swept the world, at least much of it. Philosophers like Cesare Beccaria in the 18th century argued that torture and cruel punishments were not only inhumane, but ineffective and unjust. Movements for human rights gained momentum. Religious and moral perspectives evolved too, emphasizing mercy and the value of every individual soul. Bit by bit, laws changed. Cruel and unusual punishment was explicitly outlawed in documents like the English Bill of Rights of 1689 and later the U.S. Constitution's Eighth Amendment. The guillotine, grim as it was, represented a step toward reducing suffering in capital punishment. By the 20th century, many countries had abolished the death penalty altogether or reserved it for only the gravest crimes, carried out in the most instantaneous way possible. That's not to say everything is perfect now. Far from it. 20th century wars showed us that humans still could invent appalling cruelties. The torture experiments of totalitarian regimes, genocides, chemical horrors. And even today, reports emerge from time to time of torture being used in secret prisons or extremist groups reviving medieval brutality to strike fear. Some judicial systems still employ harsh corporal punishments, caning, for example, in a few countries for certain crimes, or amputations and floggings under strict interpretations of Sharia law. And of course, the death penalty itself is still around in many parts of the world, though generally carried out by methods considered relatively quick: lethal injection, firing squad, electrocution, etc. Yet, looking at the broad sweep of history, there is a clear decline in the public spectacle of pain. What used to be entertainment and routine has become rare and widely condemned. We have, collectively, grown more empathetic, or at least more squeamish about inflicting prolonged agony, even on criminals. Today, if a government were to boil someone alive, or break them on a wheel in a public square, it would provoke international outrage and be considered a barbaric throwback. This journey through historical punishments might leave us wondering about human nature. How could we do these things to each other? And could it ever happen again on such a scale? It's a sobering thought. The capacity for cruelty is part of us, but so is the capacity for change and compassion. Remember that many who carried out these punishments truly believed they were doing what was right, for justice, for God, for order. It doesn't excuse their actions, but it helps us understand the context. We, too, in modern times, must be vigilant about our own sense of justice, ensuring that it doesn't become warped into something future generations would consider atrocious. As we close the book on this grim catalog of punishments, perhaps the biggest takeaway is a sense of relief that we live now and not then. That if we make a misstep, we won't be subjected to the Iron Maiden or the Strappado, or have our tongue cut out. Modern prisons and courts have plenty of issues, but they are paradises compared to the dungeons of old. It's also strangely fascinating to see how inventive humans can be, not just in art and science, but unfortunately in torment. The very creativity applied to torture devices speaks to the imaginative power of the human mind, albeit directed toward dark ends. In a way, studying these methods is like staring into a nightmare and realizing it's all real, and then awakening to appreciate the comparatively gentle world we inhabit now. If you've made it this far, thank you for accompanying me on this journey. I know it hasn't been easy listening. Certainly not the typical relaxing bedtime story. And yet, there is value in understanding what came before us. It teaches us empathy, and it teaches us to cherish the progress we've made. So as you settle in and perhaps finally drift off to sleep, let's end on a note of hope. Humanity, for all its flaws and horrific past, has the capacity to learn, to improve, and to choose kindness over cruelty. The whips and racks of history are mostly gathering dust in museums now. May they remain there, relics of a bygone era that we study but never recreate. Sleep well, and let the past stay in the past. Tomorrow is a new day, and thankfully, we live in a time when justice, while still imperfect, strives to be more humane than ever before. Good night and sweet dreams.